Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, today we're actually going to be speaking about a very sensitive topic. And that is, well, in Arabic, it's called الترف. And I actually chose this book to talk about because this book, it should actually be translated in English, I must admit. I think the author did an outstanding job. And he went into all these different ends of speaking about luxury and the impact it has on one, the Muslim individuals and also the society at large, and what it can do and the dangers it can do not only to the Muslim society, but to all the societies as well throughout history. Now, I can't speak about this book alone without actually talking about another book that I would say is probably to be, I would say, the aiding book in order to understand the first book. In this book, the good news, it's actually translated into English. And this book, sorry, but we got a little glitch right here. This book translated into English, although he actually wrote it in Arabic. You could see that this is by Abu Hassan Nadwi. Abu Hassan Nadwi, an important Indian scholar. I would say he wasn't really given the honor that he really deserves. This is Abu Hassan Nadwi. And of course, just to note, Abu Hassan Nadwi actually grew up and when his father had actually died. So his mother was the one that really took care of him, along with his brother, who was actually studying medicine in India. And Abu Hassan Nadwi was a very important figure that had brought the revival of Islam both in India and even the Arabic Muslim world. A very important figure, although a lot of these different so-called terrorist watch would actually consider him as the other figure for the rise of terrorism and all that stuff. But who cares about all of that stuff? In this book, Islam and the World, I absolutely recommend that book. I actually studied that book when I was in ninth grade, and it was one of the most important books that really affected me. It's in Arabic, it's called ماذا خسر العالم بانحطاط المسلمين. And in that book, he actually talks about the rise of Islam and then later what happened to the Muslim civilization and how luxury had actually brought an end not only to the Muslim civilization, but also to the other civilizations around the world, and even historically, whether we're talking about the Greek, or whether we're talking about the Romans, or whether we're talking about the pharaohs, etc. And of course, he very importantly, let's say it that way, he focuses on the Muslims, their rise, and how eventually they went into this fall, and then later that the Muslims themselves had been nothing but the focus and the place of other countries' abuse. Now, it's really important to read this book and take the time to read every single page in it, because a lot of it is actually going into history, speaking about politics, and many times people don't recognize that when you speak about history, when you're speaking about politics, it is not separated from Aqidah, because I always say, remember, two-thirds of the Quran is actually talking about certain things in history. Because when you're talking about history, oftentimes you're actually talking about the history of humanity and the relationship with the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the relationship with Aqidah, the legal maxims of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when you're reading Quran, you're actually seeing that the Quran itself is letting you recognize the relationship between the rise and the fall of different civilizations, or even the rise and fall of humanity, and how they had went from one level to another simply because of engaging in different forms of luxury or different forms of ecstasy, and how throughout history, whether we're talking about Qawm Lut, or whether we're talking about the pharaohs, or whether we're talking about political luxury, or whether we're talking about sexual luxury, or whether we're talking about financial luxury and trying to seek different means to get more finances, like during the time of Shu'aib, or whether we're talking about architecture luxury, just like Qawm Thamud and Qawm Ad. We're talking about different forms of luxury that the Quran was actually emphasizing and telling us, well, they actually went into this kind of life, and this kind of life got them away from recognizing their Lord Almighty. This kind of life led them to forgetting that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that actually gave them all the different tools of expanding their lifestyle, but they took advantage and actually attributed, one, to themselves, two, it actually made them seek more of it rather than recognizing the mission that they were supposed to be using these tools for. So later, from wanting to get these tools as means of survival, to later making it as a mean of entertainment, as a mean of getting more and more of the ego. And that's where that luxury actually comes in, where the dangers of luxury. So in this book actually comes exactly in the same topic, but looks at the word الترف, or luxury, from a different angle, and where it studies the politics of it, and also the history of it, and the relationship it had to the personal lives and the individual lives of Muslims, and later that you cannot separate the individual situation that the Muslims were living from the political the defeat that they later had faced. And this is extremely important, because if we're actually going to be speaking about bringing in victory, bringing in the change in the Muslim Ummah, it actually starts with the individual. You may not be capable of changing everything in the society, but start with your individual lifestyle. How are you making the change? So in the book that we're actually right there going to be going over is basically, like I said, he's more going into talking about it from different angles. Muhammad Musa Sharrif is the author, and I would like to say that Muhammad Musa Sharrif, being the author, I think it's very important that we would at least make dua for this scholar that is right now being jailed by the Saudi government. He is a pilot, and also has a degree in Quranic studies, PhD in Quranic studies, and of course, lectures on Islamic history, and also the Islamic history, and of course the relationship between the rise of the Ummah, the rise of our deen, and also the lifestyle that we were living. And his focus was a lot in reviving the history of the Salihin. The history of the Salihin, something is happening. I think it's telling me that something is happening. Okay, the rise of the Salihin. So he focuses a lot on history, biography, and part of that, he wanted to take, I guess, a different lens. He's been imprisoned now for, I believe, 7 years. 7 years, even though he should definitely be a person that is honored for all the different lectures that he had given, for all the different work that he was trying to revive within the Ummah, but instead is basically imprisoned for 7 years now. So we could make dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would grant him freedom, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would also reward him for all the effort that he had actually done, whether in this book or in other books. There are great other books. This is actually important to translate. So Muhammad Musa Sharrif writing this book, he wanted to focus on luxury and the impact it has on those that are working in da'wah and even those that are salihin. Now, it's important to remember that when we're speaking about it, he does actually go into different areas, whether we're talking about it from the history side or whether the meaning of luxury, or whether we're talking about what does it mean to actually live in types of luxury. Or shouldn't we be concerned about, yes, quality of life improvement and all of that? So should we not have a quality of life improvement? Does that contradict what Islam says? Should we be living some form of simple life, a simple life where we really are like Bedouins? What does that actually mean? So that's why we're just going to go over some of the things to answer some of these questions. So the first one is really, what does luxury or taraf mean? Now, the word taraf actually means the expansion and to expand the quality of life. And that's why if you look into the Quran, the word tarafa, or the root tarafa, was actually mentioned eight different ayat in the Quran, such as ma utrifu fi. But all the times that a taraf was mentioned in, or of course, I'm going to use the word taraf, but the word taraf to actually mean luxury, all the times that luxury was mentioned in was more of trying to reveal and expose that taraf or luxury is actually something that is dangerous and something that not only is affecting the outside of their life, but also inside their hearts as well. So when you're looking at taraf, it's not making a quality of life, but it's actually exaggerating on the quality of life to the point that it's that the person becomes, from trying to expand or from trying to at least bring in stability in the quality of life, to actually expanding in ways that is not necessarily for the stability of their life, but is actually taking them in more of luxury. So that's why you could see in the different ayat, it was always associating that all those nations that had been corrupted were actually as a result of engaging in taraf, engaging in luxury, that was actually the start. So the connection and the correlation between taraf and basically richness, or the let's call it having a lot of money and trying to be rich and so forth, not necessarily is every type of luxury necessarily correlated with being rich. But here's one thing: a person that is rich is more susceptible to getting, let's call it, getting into the trap, or even finding themselves slipping into seeking luxury. Why is that? Because usually somebody that is poor is usually focusing on getting the main necessities, getting the main for their life. If they don't have food, well, they're searching for food. They're definitely not looking for cakes and desserts. They're just trying to search for simple meals to help them survive. So you're seeing a lot of correlation between getting more wealth and between getting all the different resources, but the expansion and exaggerating those resources basically becomes more in when there is richness involved, when there is more money involved. But at the same time, you can have somebody that is rich, but not necessarily living in taraf. So somebody can be rich, but the wealth is in their hand and not in their heart. What does that metaphor mean? So when we say in their hand, we're actually relating that they're controlling, one, their needs and their wants, to make sure that it's actually going with and fitting the principle that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had asked us to live in, how we do the money management. But a person that has the money in their heart, they actually live to let their heart keep wanting more and more. In other words, here, heart is basically speaking about the nafs, the person's nafs of simply motivating them to always work on getting more of what their desires are seeking in order to get one, probably fame, or probably more ecstasy, or more and more happiness, and eventually more of dunya. And that basically gets them into this taraf they will eventually not be able to control. So you have people that have the money are more susceptible to getting into taraf, but the people that have the money may not necessarily be getting into taraf, depending on how they're relating with money. Now, it's really important to mention that when we're speaking about taraf, how do I actually manage and make sure that, yes, I've got the money, my husband's making 400 or 500 probably thousand K a year or whatever, so $500,000. How can I make sure that I'm not getting into taraf? So that's where number one, that's where you had al fiqh, or the Islamic literature, basically helping you understand the guidance of how you relate with wealth. Is that overspending? How much is spending? And giving you all the different regulations to make sure that you're spending within the area, one, through the lens of three areas. One, it's called the daruriyat. Two is called the al-hajiyat, and three is called the tahsiniyat. Now, what are these? The number one thing is basically the necessity. The two are basic. The necessity simply means you're covering the most important things in your life. So, for example, you're looking at things that relate to your deen. So you're trying to cover the basic things that relate to your deen. Probably your kids in an Islamic school, probably you living in an environment that is preserving your deen, or number two is that you're an area or probably spending money for your healthcare coverage, etc., and you're spending money to probably get the basics to get your children married, yourself married, or even covering the simple necessities for food items, etc. Those are daruriyat, those are the necessities. The let's say the upper level is basically going to be the needs, in where, yes, you need a refrigerator. Right now, if you don't get a refrigerator during our times, the refrigerator is basically to keep the food from going bad, etc. So that becomes a need. Microwave is a need. Maybe different things. Now you're going to another level, which is a want. Well, do I really need, yes, I would like more monitors, but do I really need a monitor that's probably the biggest monitor, as big as a wall? Do I really need all these different things? Do I really need a car that's probably 200 or $28,000? Do I really need something even more expensive? And yes, probably end up paying leases, or probably end up paying payments for a car, payments for furniture, payments for the house payments. Yes, I can buy a house that's probably 250,000, or you can buy a house that's $500,000, and then you're going to end up paying payments on it, and then you're going to find yourself when I was stuck in these payments. Do I necessarily want something that luxurious? What do I actually consider? Now, that's where Islam comes in and tells you, well, I want you to focus on the need. That is a necessity. And then you've got the second one is the need, but then the want, we're actually going to be looking at that fiqh side to help us understand and really live on money management, not in the lens of what I want, but based on the lens of fiqh, based on the lens of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's asking me to do the money management in the lens of preserving my deen, preserving my faith. You might say, well, I'm not doing anything haram. We're not necessarily saying doing anything haram, because here's one thing. If your limit is, yeah, I don't want to go into haram, then your limit is really tight, because you want to expand a little bit. because if your limit is not to cross the cage, but then the closer you get to the cage or you get to the dangerous fence, the more susceptible you are to actually getting into that area. So you want to stay a little bit farther. You don't want the haram to be your final limit. That's why scholars were actually talking about something that rarely, in fact, I never hear anybody talking about this, not in any muhadara, not in any lecture, which is a very important word, and that is al-muru'ah. That is al-muru'ah. Let's repeat the word al-muru'ah. What is al-muru'ah? Al-muru'ah is different than halal and haram because al-muru'ah is putting yourself at a higher standard. Your standard is not the haram. Your standard is a higher standard. Your standard is the salihin, not the standard of the limit, because the limit, that's, think of it as a Muslim and a mu'min. If your limit is Muslim limit, then you're going to find yourself, if the Muslim limit is the limit, then you're easily going to be finding yourself out of the Muslim limit and probably going into what limit? Fasiq limit. And probably later on, munafiq limit. And later on, so you're going to find yourself going farther and farther down. So if you were to actually draw this graph, you've got the Muslim is this line. Maybe we could actually draw it right here. You've got the Muslim is the line. What can you see? Let me see what you can see right there. You've got the Muslim is the line. Let's draw it just a little bit. Okay, you've got the Muslim is the line. Here we go. This is the Muslim. This is the Muslim line. And you've got this is the Mu'min line. And you've got this is the Muhsin line. And you've got this one, what's underneath the Muslim line. Let's call this the Muslim line right there. You've got the other line is basically the Munafiq line. Then you've got the Fasiq line. Then you've got the Kafir line. Now, here's one thing, is that the farther you go down, the closer you are to the gravity of kufr. Think of it this way. So al-muru'ah is taking you even higher than the Muslim line, because the other line, the other counterpart of Muslim, you want to look at it, is actually on the other end of kafir. So if this is the borderline that, oh, I don't want to do what is haram because it's going to get me into fasiq, it's going to get me into munafiq, it's going to get me into kafir, then your limit is really low. But what you're trying to seek is to be away from even khawarim al-muru'ah. What is khawarim al-muru'ah? Khawarim al-muru'ah may not necessarily be haram things. They're not necessarily haram things, but they're not honorable things that match or that are befit for a pious person to do. Let's give an example. If you were to see a scholar that's giving durus, and that they're talking about iman, they're talking about all these things. Let's say you would attend their wedding, and you would see that sheikha actually dressed in clothes that are revealing in a way that is probably, she's got the piercing and all of these things, and dancing in a way that's probably definitely not suiting what a sheikha would actually do. You would more see that it is more befit for a sheikha or a scholar or even a salih person to be dressed in a decent way, sit and even act in a decent way. That is basically, maybe the wording, you don't know what it is. You're like, I know it's not haram, but something on the inside is telling me this is not befit. This is not appropriate. That word that you may not know is, that your heart basically recognizes, is called al-muru'ah. Al-muru'ah. And that's why the scholars of hadith, when they actually had defined what it means to be al-adl, what it means to be the person that we would take hadith from, they basically said, yes, the definition of an authentic hadith is basically when I would have a chain of narration, متصل إسناده, and they said بنقل العدل الضابط. They said, well, we need that the person to be in the chain of narration who we would take our deen from is to be, look at the word al-adl, al-adala. But al-adala here is not talking about justice. This is not talking about some social justice here whatsoever. But this is actually talking about an expectation in piety, an expectation in intellect, an expectation in practice. And that's why they used the word al-adala in each and every single person in that chain of narration to have al-adala, which is in these three areas. One, their piety; two, their intellect and their mental capacity; and three, their application and how they would apply it. And part of that, they didn't consider that the limit is halal and haram. They actually considered the limit is khali min khawarim al-muru'ah. They regarded that scholar that we're taking our deen from is supposed to be not living to the limit, but is actually at a higher level. They're free from any form of dishonorable traits, which is khawarim al-muru'ah. Now, this is extremely important to keep in mind, because if we're actually going for a lower expectation, then we're really lost off limit here. Now, what is the relationship between taraf and israf? Now, the word israf usually is translated as overspending, but here's one thing: is that taraf, all right, and is saraf. When you look at the saraf, it's actually one form of of luxury. So it's really just the beginning. Remember when we say وَكُلُوا وَاشْرَبُوا وَلَا تُسْرِفُوا إِنَّهُ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُسْرِفِينَ, or كُلُوا وَاشْرَبُوا وَتَصَدَّقُوا وَالْبِسُوا فِي غَيْرِ مَخِيلَةٍ وَلَا تُسْرِفُوا. Now you look at this ayah right there where it says, and drink and eat and drink, and do not be excessive in your spending. For the Lord Almighty does not like or does not love those that are musrifin. In other words, those that spend excessively. Let's look at this hadith that actually explains this ayah and says, and eat and drink, وَتَصَدَّقُوا, and donate. And when you dress, dress without dressing in a way to reveal arrogance. In other words, don't dress to reveal arrogance. And what is arrogance? How do you dress in revealing arrogance? You dress in revealing arrogance in where what you're trying to show to others is that you've got the money. In other words, the clothes moved from having the quality of clothes, from having the clothes or the garment, from doing the job of probably covering or probably giving warmth, to actually doing something else, which is trying to reveal that you've got the money. Why is that person buying Gucci? Well, not because they were looking for a particular quality, but it's that they were trying to reveal to others that they have this type of money. They were trying to reveal the money in order to show some form of social status. To show the form of social status is basically to gain some form of authority within the society. That's al-makhila, that's arrogance. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ was explaining this ayah, وَلَا تُسْرِفُوا, in order to say, well, make sure that it's okay to actually buy when things are needed for you. Why did you buy a North Face coat? Well, because they've got this certain quality. If you're living in Minnesota, you actually need something that's bringing in the best warmth, because you can actually die of hypothermia. So here we go. I found the North Face, for example. I'm not necessarily, giving a name brand and saying this name brand is halal and that name brand is haram. Don't misunderstand me here, but I'm just giving you an example. I'm really bad with name brands, so excuse me if I'm confusing different things, but I'm just giving you an example. Don't think that I'm at all here, making any marketing for a name brand. That'll be so funny. Yes. Oh, okay. Now here's All right. So what I'm trying to say is just giving you an idea that if you're buying something because you need it, the situation is necessary for it, and that situation is not necessarily to reveal some form of status, some form of name branding to reveal arrogance, but this is something else. In that situation, that's not israf. In other words, it is within the necessity, it is within the halal parameters. It's basically going to be not going and just for excessive needs of trying to gain some form of an authority or some form of status in social status. Then in that situation, Abu Zahra, I met his granddaughter in Qatar. Mashallah, she's actually a scholar in Quranic studies, and Abu Zahra was an Egyptian scholar, and in fact, he was the leading scholar in Al Azhar for a very long time. So it's really sad. You could see that he actually died 1316 Hijriya. So what does that actually mean in? Or no, he actually died 1394 Hijriya. So we're looking at the 70s, I guess. The 70s, I guess. Don't take my word for it. But I think it's really important to go over some of the books. By the way, Abu Zahra actually wrote a number of different important books in fiqh, in in hadith as well, not in hadith, mainly fiqh and mainly in the different sciences of Islam. Wrote some books about Shafi'i, Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, etc. Biographies, or even the fiqh and the different books on fiqh, lots of fatwa as well in the sciences of Islam. So definitely his books are definitely great resources for those that want to study Islamic sciences. Now, in the second chapter, this author actually goes into speaking about what was mentioned in regards to taraf in both al-Kitab and the Sunnah and al-Athar. The difference between the Kitab is basically referring to Al-Quran, Sunnah is referring to the hadith attributed to the Prophet ﷺ. Al-Athar are basically the quotes that are attributed to the Sahaba or the Tabi'in. All right, so those are the differences of resources. Let's see the first one. So you look at the Quran. وَإِذَا أَرَدْنَا أَن نُهْلِكَ قَرْيَةً أَمَرْنَا مُتْرَ فِيهَا فَفَسَقُوا فِيهَا فَحَقَّ عَلَيْهَا الْقَوْلُ فَدَمَّرْنَاهَا تَدْمِيرًا. What happened? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, there in this ayah, you could see Surah Al-Isra, ayah 16. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders that a certain country or a certain place is destructed, what they would engage in is basically in more taraf, in more luxury. And then the luxury leads them to fisq. Remember that line, the blue lines that we drew earlier? You've got Islam, you've got fisq, you've got nifaq, you've got kufr. That's the same thing, in where they would go into engaging more and more luxury. In other words, that they have the resources, they had the resources, they expanded in their resources, they end up then going into fisq, because now they moved from looking for their survival needs and covering their survival needs to wanting to expand onto more and more of luxury. So then what happens? فَحَقَّ عَلَيْهَا الْقَوْلِ. Then the decree of the Lord Almighty. What is the decree of the Lord Almighty? Yes, number one is that if they would engage in this fall, then the decree of the Lord Almighty is basically you engage in this fall, you go against the decree of the Lord Almighty, you go against the instinct that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you, you go against your own interest, then what you end up with is really yourself killing yourself into the suicide, not literally jumping into the suicide, but you are going against your own interest. You're letting your luxury, you're letting your own self get into more and more of that ecstasy, which your body was not created for. So you end up really breaking what your body was created for. You end up killing yourself without you recognizing. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned that they basically ended up leading themselves into more and more here. مُتْرَ فِيهَا فَفَسَقُوا فِيهَا. That type of luxurious life led them to more fitna, them to more haram things, let them get into more of the fawahish, more of sin, and that basically let them get away from the path of the Lord Almighty, the principle of the Lord Almighty, and then they ended up getting basically the punishment of the Lord Almighty. Sayyid Qutb, I love, Sayyid Qutb, I would say Sayyid Qutb is a figure that is really abused, to be honest, was really abused. I mean, Sayyid Qutb, he was executed by the Egyptian government at the time. And in the beginning, well, he was writing. He was writing in a very famous journal at the time, and then later, of course, because he was accused of being part of the Muslim Brotherhood, then he was well, basically expelled. In other words, deported to the US. Ironically, deported. It's supposed to be the other way around. He was basically sent to the US, goes to the US, and that was in the 50s. And I don't know if you had in your school, there was a book, it was called The Great Gatsby, and how they were living their life in the Great Gatsby style, and they were dancing all the time, and they're dancing in the 50s and the 60s, and they're dancing for such long hours. And remember, Sayyid Qutb was actually sent to the US during that time, and he was actually just watching their lifestyle, how it was going into such luxury, where the at the time in the 50s, that lifestyle was taking them away from what they were before that, trying to live and make the US. Now they were going into that lifestyle of dancing and this type of this type of let's call it, the over luxury. Let's just leave it at that. And then he said that all the people in every single nation, those that live in that type of luxury, they would basically get into the higher level, and then they would find the wealth, and then they would get into having more and more of the slaves or the people to serve them and all of that, and then they would find all the rest and all the luxury in that, and then they end up going, yes, in some form of authority, and then their nufus, their own selves, would just become weakened. By time, they would just become so weakened, they would get used to such luxury that they would end up living in seeking more of ecstasy. And then they basically start letting go because they enjoy the ecstasy. They start enjoying a lot of that type of the enjoyment, that they would want more and more of it. So then they start giving up on their principles, and then giving away on their religious duties, or even on what was considered as divine or what was considered as sacred. And little by little, they start going into more and more sins. Then, if وهم إذا لم يجدوا من يضرب على أيديهم عاثوا في الأرض فسادا. And if they don't find anybody to stop them from going even further down, then they go out of their, let's call it, space, and then they would want to get into other people's spaces in order to steal from their resources, and take from their resources and even force it on others. Well, wow, sounds so familiar, doesn't it? Well, don't remember Qawm Lut? Now, they didn't want to just nadihum al-munkar and practice it in their clubs, but they actually wanted to force it on others, wanted to bring it into their home, wanted Qawm Lut, they wanted Prophet Lut alayhi salam, said, we need your guests to be with us. No, we need them. No, we need to come into your home. And that's the same thing. Even when you're seeing right now, for example, no, it's like, no, every single person around the world, you have to accept this new style, this new liberalism. And if you don't accept it, we're going to force you to it. If you don't accept it, and we're going to sanction you to it. If you don't accept to the sanctions, then we'll just label you that you're anti-human rights and you're anti-human and you're not giving people their spaces, and we're supposed to step in to support them. And all of a sudden, it becomes a social justice issue. All of a sudden, they start labeling it as part of the social justice. And then he said, and then people would, little by little, they would lose their energy to basically find and seek the resources that first brought it this power. So what you're actually seeing here in the US, for example, or in the West, is really not new. Because even when the Muslim nations in the past, when we're going to talk about it in just a bit, even when, if it's a Muslim nation, if they keep it getting into that surge of luxury, that will lead to their demise, that will lead to their decline, their fall. It will lead to weakening their power to stay strong. That's why you're seeing, even in our ages, you'll see the mothers, of course, of the past. My own mother was definitely stronger than me. My grandmother was definitely stronger than me, because they had it way much harder than we had it, and their bodies were stronger because their means of survival were definitely stronger. And that's why they needed to work harder to just make one piece of bread, to just make us a dish. Right now, all I need to do is just turn on the stove. But in the past, they needed to get the woods, they needed to get everything, they needed to, but yeah, they would get burned, they needed to work out the means for the struggling and for their survival. But definitely, once we got used to all this luxury, we just didn't know how to go back. And in fact, we would definitely not know how to survive in a situation when we had gotten so used to the luxury that surrounds us. And that's why Sayyid Qutb connects between the nation, and any nation that is going extravagant with seeking the means of more and more luxury, and then later being incapable of maintaining their ability in what got them to that level. They become so accustomed to this luxury that they don't even recognize all the efforts that happened before to maintain it. And as we say, easy come, easy go. And that's why, if you want to provide for your children, if you think that by providing for them is by making things easy for them, you're actually making it easy come, easy go. Even for parenting, let them learn how to get those resources and not necessarily provide it for them. Let the child get up and heat your own meal, get up and make your own food, put the laundry yourself. Even if he's 11 or 12 years old or 10 years old, put your own laundry in the washing machine. Learn how to do it. Learn how to maintain your life. Even if it's a 13 or a 14-year-old girl, let her learn how to cook, or let her learn how to do all these things. Right now, we're seeing women at age 25 and 27 and 28 and 30 can't even cook a simple meal, can't even do a simple thing. Her mother is still putting her laundry for her when she's even a woman, gets married and doesn't know how to do simple things. And of course, doesn't even know how to fix her own room or his own room. Simple things they can't do. And we're still, yes, let's just get someone to lawnmower grass. Why isn't your son doing it? Why isn't your son taking out the garbage? Why are you doing it? And what we end up seeing is really all of this. These are you might think these are simple things, but those are actually just seeing how all of this actually leads, the more luxury, it actually leads to our own defeat on an individual level and our own defeat on a community level. And that's why he was saying that, but by living into that fisq, by living into that level of luxury where it leads to out of the level of Islam and getting into the crossing even the boundaries of haram, it ends up getting them weaker and weaker in their bodies, weaker and weaker, and eventually ends up that they cannot maintain those means, and they end up becoming the ones to bring about the destruction within that society. And it's really important to mention that, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created these patterns in the world around us. And if you think you're an exception, you've got it wrong. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us to look into all those nations that had lived before us in order to see the patterns. You're not an exception to this pattern. This pattern is basically ruling and basically uh, leading and ruling all these nations throughout history. So you're just going to be going with the pattern, seeing that once you give up on the the principles of the Lord Almighty, and you get into just the mode and just your efforts and your energy just to be in search of more ecstasy and not anymore in support and with the mission to bring about and maintain principle, this is a nation that is in decline, that is in the process of decline, and just moments, years and a couple years, and it would basically start becoming rest in not peace, but it will be resting in destruction. Resting in destruction, or it won't be resting, because that's an oxymoron. It would basically become doomed in destruction. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the Prophet ﷺ, you could actually see a number of different hadith actually speaking about even the simplest things in our life, in where make sure that even in what you eat and what you drink and what you wear and the type of homes that you live in, it's always emphasizing on the importance of moderation, the importance of moderation, from food to eating to drinking, etc. And this type of lifestyle here in America, where yes, he didn't like mommy's food, so what does he do? Well, he basically goes and dines out, and every single meal they don't eat leftovers because they're not used to leftovers, because it's not luxurious. They want it served now. This is actually problematic, because this type of actually starts from simple things at home. They are actually those practices that you practice daily. What you eat, the routine, how you wake up, how you sleep, what you wear, what time you wake up, all of these different things, they become the routine that will subconsciously affect your mind and what you are actually in search of. And that's why Umar ibn al-Khattab would always take those things seriously, because he learned it from the Prophet ﷺ. And that's why he said, إِيَّاكُمْ وَالتَّنَعُمْ وَزِيُّ الْعَجَمْ وعليكم بالشمس فإنها حماء عرب وتمعددوا واخشوشنوا واخشوشبوا واخلولقوا وأعطوا الركب أسنتها وانزوا نزوا وارموا الأغراض. It's really strange here how Umar ibn Khattab, although you don't necessarily have to take each and every single one of these words necessarily, literally, but I'm just going to read it literally and then I'm going to explain certain things. Okay, so he said, stay away from all the luxury and be and beware and keep away from التنعم وزي العجم, from dressing and dressing like العجم. العجم are the non-Arab, in where it was all about luxury. And he said, وَعَيْكُمْ بِالشَّمْس. He was saying basically stay under the sun. Now this is not necessarily staying under the sun to actually mean to actually mean staying literally under the sun, but he's basically saying, don't be so keen on trying to get into a lot of luxurious architecture. He basically uses the word فإنها حمام العرب, because that's the حمام العرب. Basically, it's kind of like saying, well, this is our form of sauna. حمام العرب is like our form of sauna, the Arab sauna. وتمعددوا, تمعددوا is like be like the tribe of Adnan, the tribe of Adnan, and where they are tough, they're strong. And he said literally, وَخْشَوْشِنُوا. خْشَوْشِنُوا would actually mean be living in things that are not soft. Don't be soft, and be the ones to actually be like a log, in where you're strong, you're raising your back, you're strong, being capable of standing up. Don't easily be bent down. And of course, and he was basically here, this is more of a metaphor in where it's even when you're riding on camels, or you're riding on riding on horses, that you're basically going in, it's, even if there's no saddle on it, but in the end is basically giving you this idea. The most important thing, I guess, for us, I'm not telling you to be under the sun, but this is be strong, be a person that is not always dependent on getting more and more of these items. The more items you get, and especially during war times, it's basically all about selling items of luxury, items of that are basically making life easier for you. So here, Umar ibn Khattab, the most important thing that we want to get to is basically don't focus on trying to get items of luxury and constantly just going to Amazon or going shopping in search of more and more of these luxury items. Make sure you maintain it for things that you really need. And here, Abu Zahra, again, our Egyptian scholar, he said the Khulafa al-Rashidin had given a great example in fighting luxury. And he said Abu Bakr as-Siddiq would actually live a life that is, even though he was rich, but then when he had become the Khalifa, he lived a life that was simple. Umar ibn al-Khattab also lived a life that was simple, and he even had his own stick with him, and he basically would be, even though capable of having all the different resources, same thing, but he was living a simple life. Ali ibn Abi Talib, same thing. He could have actually lived this life of richness. Uthman Affan was a little different, but at the end of the day, is that his wealth was not in his heart, but in his hand. Now, in the third chapter, he talks about something rather really interesting, how luxury affects the people's energy, how they end up using their energy not for bringing in what brings in the means of survival, but it ends up really just going more and more into, let's call it the gravity of this earth, because they're just getting into that luxury, and then they end up just seeking more and more of that ecstasy. So he talks about, for example, the Romans and the Persians, how at one time they were the leading empires when they were getting into those resources. They managed to find the resources. And Nadwi, the Indian scholar that we talked about, he actually said that that the social the social illicit behavior had reached its climax in the Persian, and of course the Persian and even the Byzantine Empire, to the point that they'd actually led them to get engaging more and more in illicit behavior and immorality. And then that ended up being the main goal in their life. It was all about getting more resources. It was all about trying to abuse these resources in order to spend, in order to get more to feed their lust. And then he said, and then what you had come across is that the melting of all the different main pillars that would keep and maintain principle. Little by little, principle was a price that they need. It was the trade-off. It was something that they had to give up on in order to engage more and more ecstasy. It was a price to pay. It was a trade-off, and then end up not only leaving morality, but it ended up even giving up and choosing chastity, because they could engage in zina. In other words, it wasn't, we don't need marriage anymore. We could just use mistresses. We could just engage in zina, and we don't necessarily need to be in a marriage relationship. And this sounds very similar to what's happening today, even in the Muslim community. The Muslims are right now living a Western lifestyle where girls are basically saying, well, I want to get a job, I want to maintain a job, I want to get a degree to get a job, I don't want to get married, I don't want a man to tell me what to do, I don't want this to, I don't want to have children, because they're right now absorbing the feminist ideology, in where, yes, children are going to be a struggle, they're going to be a responsibility, so therefore I don't want to get married, I don't want children, I want to get a job, I want money, I don't want a husband to boss me around. And what you end up with is basically men trying to find mistresses, and women trying to find more money, and men trying to find more money. What's happening? It's basically the decline of akhlaq, the decline of morality, the decline of principle. And what is that? That was really wanting taraf. It was not wanting the moderation. It was trying to get into more and more of dunya. That's why in Nadwi actually speaks about how both the Persian Empire and the Roman or the Byzantine Empire, their life was just dependent on luxury later on. And then basically they went so much into that, they were drowning into that, where even the kings, and of course those in the government in the Persian Empire, basically were living in such extravagance that they basically just wanted an increase in that. And then eventually that led that they had to abuse even the people that were under their power. They started using and letting their energy be the energy that is just feeding their luxury. So what you end up with is, here we go, that and of course that wasn't just in, let's say, in the non-Arab areas, but that was also in the Arab areas, even the Byzantine Empire in the Arab areas, the Bilad al-Shem. You look into the Levant, you go to Syria, you go to those countries, and you would see that the architecture was not to make just the necessary let's say castles that are needed, but no, it was going extravagant in even designing that architecture. Well, I mean, let's get into a lot of these things, and where, of course, what did that end up? Well, in order to make these politicians politicians live an extravagant life, to support their extravagant life, they had to make sure that they would force taxes on the people. And who are the people? Well, they had to force taxes on the simple farmers that are trying to make a living. And you end up seeing people really just living, majority of the people living the social injustice. Well, that's the same thing even right now, where you're seeing even in the West, the politicians and those capitalists are basically living the extravagant life, and the other people are basically living paycheck to paycheck and barely making it. And then they would think, well, I've got my freedom, or maybe you are told that you're getting your freedom, when reality you're just living paycheck to paycheck, trying to maintain the simple life, and probably, trying to maintain the survival. That's basically it. Let's go for the Greek. The Greek, same thing. Their focus was, they were living such a materialistic life, and we considered that the main source of human power, or basically the manpower, and that's why they would have all the different idols and all these different statues, really of a man's body, and usually a naked man's body, because they considered that that was the source of power. It was just trying to be extravagant in that, and it was all about, well, let's focus on the human power, the manpower to be exact. And that's why they went into the Olympics, and they generated the idea of the Olympics, etc. And then they basically started glorifying their gods by the different dancing and the different songs and etc. And then that became the main idea for even the fall of the Greek Empire. It was going into a different type of extravagance. Let's go for Al-Andalus. Are the Muslims an exception? Absolutely not. Even the Muslims are not an exception. Al-Andalus, when you look at Al-Andalus, you actually think of, okay, there was this Muslim civilization that was a great civilization. Well, it was a great civilization indeed, but even the Muslims, they too fell in the same pattern. When you go to Spain, or what used to be Al-Andalus, which Muslims had ruled for 800 years, you look at the remains of it, and you see how there was a lot focus on architecture, but the architecture and the poetry that they had left behind was really revealing that they were a nation that at one point, even if you were to study, this is really interesting, if you were to go to the scholars and really study the type of poetry and even the fiqh, the earlier you go into the Andalus era, the Andalus, let's call it governance, the earlier you go into, let's say, 400, the 400 Hijriya, you would see that the scholars were really focused on fiqh, were doing excellent in fiqh. And then further on in history, they were actually engaging in very, let's call it inappropriate poetry, and there was a lot of illicit behavior that the women, the men were engaging in. There was a lot of focus on just seeking more and more of luxury, which actually maintains until today. You would see the type of castles that they were building, the type of even the statues that were actually against Islam. And it's really strange how, what the Prophet ﷺ was actually fighting all the years when he was giving dawah is how dangerous these statues were for the fall of Tawheed. But then the Muslim empire, the Muslim Andalus, was actually engaging in, let's call it, reviving the Jahiliyyah that Islam was that Islam was actually fighting. They were now reviving Jahiliyyah again, making statues, making the same illicit behavior, the poetry, the zina was flourishing without people even talking about it and exposing it. It was becoming just a time of just seeking more and more luxury. In other words, الترف or luxury and the extravagance and living a life of extravagance, it is simply the suicide of every nation, whether that nation was Muslim or whether that nation was not Muslim. Because once the people are living extravagance, then they end up giving up on the principle that once made this nation be. That once made this nation be, and it becomes what will eventually kill it. So you could see in Andalus itself, they basically started getting into they themselves losing their deen, getting into more jahiliyyah, going into different cults, going into more divisions until it became 22 different states, from a unified state to 22 different states. So when you see more divisions, you see it is actually a reflection of people going into more and more of what is not necessary. They just are not recognizing the necessity. They're just trying to just engage in, let's call it luxurious luxury in extravagance, where they're actually becoming more virtual. Now let me focus on the word virtual, and what I mean by virtual is not the virtual of today of Zoom and all of that. What we mean by virtual is actually going into fantasy. And that's what happened even in Al-Andalus. They were engaging in fantasy. They were getting a lot of these slave women and these songs, and they were engaging in all of these Andalusiyat and all of the music, and they were getting into a lot of drinking as well, and it was becoming an a place of fitna. It was becoming a place of feed nothing but the same thing that the other nations were getting into. It was the fall. It was the fall of the nation. It was it was the fall of that nation. And there you end up with basically, let's see what right there, when you look at when things go out of hand, and even though the princes themselves, they would basically engage into just wanting to make sure that they're getting into um, uh, enhancing and enforcing their power to just basically make sure that their castles are safe. What do you got? You basically end up even later, easily the Christian forces from the Spaniards were now coming in, the different forces in Al-Andalus, and then the families themselves, they started giving up without any type of an opposition or even a revolution or even fighting for that. And then they ended up being forced to give up on their Islam eventually. And those were the Moors. They end up losing their Islam eventually. And I was really, I was really astonished to learn about my and part of my ancestry. They were actually part of the Moors, the Torres. And on my mother's side, there's one ancestry. They're basically called the Torres. And I was searching part of their history. They were actually the Moors. They were part of the Moors that lived in Spain that had a history of being Muslim, and later they gave up on their Islam because of the torture. They were persecuted to give up on their Islam, and they became Catholic. And subhanAllah, that's what happens. You eventually lose your principle little by little, and then you end up not being capable of protecting your identity. And that's not only in Al-Andalus, but that's also the case. لا ارخي. That's also the case not only with Al-Andalus, but that's also the case even with the Abbasid Khilafah. With the Abbasid Khilafah, it was a powerful nation, but powerful nation that later became defeated by the Mongols. Now, mind you, the Mongols were at the time, now just look into this, all right? This is really interesting. The Abbasid Khilafah at the time was actually considered the most extravagant civilization. It was considered a civilization that had universities, a civilization that had all the power, a civilization that had water flowing, a civilization that had the scholars coming in. It was considered the most powerful nation educationally, politically, militarily, etc. But then the Mongols, who did not have an education, who did not actually have any of those resources that the Khilafah had, but then they were abusing their need and they were really trying to expand for more resources. They basically literally walk from Mongolia and every single nation that they were going westwards, every single nation that they were from the Muslim nations, of course, and even non-Muslims, they were going, here we go, Afghanistan, we got right there, Uzbekistan, all these, Kazakhstan, etc., Iran, etc. Then we got to the capital of the Khilafah, which is Iraq, and killed, slaughtered, in fact, 1 million Muslims in Baghdad. 1 million Muslims in Baghdad. Ibn al-Athir actually talks about the bodies that were there and the number of people that were killed, where death was the only thing you could smell. Death was the only thing you could smell, because the Khilafah at the time was engaged in so much extravagance. Even the issues that they were discussing, is the Quran makhluk? Is it not? How do we? Indeed, it was not an issue that whatsoever the Prophet ﷺ had discussed or anything of that, but they were just spending their effort even on matters that were not at all the core of Islam. They were now importing different literature from the Greek, and then right now using it, the tool to reread and reinterpret Islam. And now they were getting into this type of luxury where it was just to give the Khalifa the power, and then eventually just the Mughal, the Mongols didn't even have the resources that the Khilafah, that the Abbasid had. They were defeated, killed with just a matter of days, because they didn't even recognize or prepare themselves how the Mongols were already defeating one country after the other. They were just so engaged in their luxury that they didn't even have any preparation. They were just worried about having all those different curtains, all the different what's it called, the statues, and all the different types of fragrances, the different types of beautification, all the ways of making life luxury, and all the different types of public bathrooms, and all the different types of animals, and all the races and animal races. All of that became just what they were looking for. When it was time to gain forces to defeat the Mongols, they were already just not prepared, because they didn't even know to do it. They didn't even know how to do it. If a person is living a lifestyle of luxury, well, they're not going to be capable of facing hunger, or even be capable of facing the exposure of the different the hardship in life. They were just so much into all the different harems, or the different the different women and all of that, and singing, and they just basically left all of that, and they end up losing the Khilafah itself in 656 Hijriya. That's why Abu al-Hasan Nadwi, again, our famous figure that we were just talking about, he said what had actually come onto the Arab nations is basically an era in history where all the life was just going around in being centered around one figure, and that person is the king or the Khalifa, and a couple politicians around him, and then the end, and the city was just considered basically just a property for this king. And that's the same thing that's happening even today, where all of the sudden MBS is considering himself as basically the one to own Saudi Arabia and all the resources, and the people of Ibn Zayed, they basically own all the resources of what UAE land is producing. And same thing when you're talking about all the different, not Gulf countries, but the same thing with every single Muslim country. The king basically becomes the real and the ultimate owner of all those resources. And you could see all the other people really struggling for survival, really just trying to make the resources available for the master king. And what happens is that you end up not only with social injustice, but even those that want to stand up and object to what this king is doing and to the oppression that is happening, they basically end up being thrown in jail, which is basically exactly what happened to the author of this book that we're actually talking about. So here he said, it is not, is that his quote? No, it was actually Nedawi's quote. And he said, so really, technically, at the end of the different, whether we're talking about the end of Al-Abbasiyya, the end of Khilafah Abbasiyya, the end of Al-Andalus, etc., he says it was really technically not an Islamic era or even of anything that was at all a rational, natural evolution, but it was not something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or Islam or even our mind or intellect would accept whatsoever. In fact, Islam had come to bring a destruction to this type of extravagance and this type of illicit, of course, immorality that was there. In fact, that was the era that the Prophet ﷺ had been brought into, and he would actually call it the time of Jahiliyyah. He would basically object to this lifestyle of what the Caesars and the different Persian and Hercules and their lifestyle, and then Prophet ﷺ had basically objected to this lifestyle that they were living in, a very harsh objection. But then he basically, it's really sad to see that that the Ummah unfortunately did not recognize and had forgotten what the Prophet Muhammad ibn Abdullah had come with, the message, the mission that he had come with. And that's what luxury and that's what extravagance actually leads to. It leads not only the Muslims, but same thing, we're talking about France. It was not capable because, and here Montgomery actually speaks about how when the French were engaging in so much luxury, in so much zina, that they did not actually have the power to defeat the Nazis. Well, I'll just make it really short here. They didn't have the power to defeat the Nazis because they didn't even have the family structure there. And look at that, or the family structure is actually key to making sure that you've got the morality in place, because family structure is the basis, call it the core of a country's and a nation's structure. Once the family structure is broken, then you've got another family structure is broken, and you've got a whole nation with family structures being broken, and single parent is the common and family is the least common or probably the exception. And in that situation, you're talking about the division of family leads to the division of a nation. The division of a nation leads to the collapse of that nation. And he basically starts talking about, well, that's exactly what happened even during the World War One, and even in the World War One, and how France wasn't capable of defeating the Nazis because the family itself was corrupt. The family itself was not there, so you got a whole nation that basically did not have the foundation. And I love this quote. The Sayyid Qutb, he basically says this. He says, and those that go against the instinct, there's no way that they can go without a punishment. If you go against your instinct, you're going to get punished for it. And he said, and it is a horrific and a magnificent and a big punishment. Because if it was going to be open, the doors were going to be open to all the different goods and all the different extravagant lifestyle, and just an increase in their income, and just an increase in all the virtual happiness that they were thinking that they were going to get, then in that situation you have to recognize that the human life, and that all the different rules that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had actually put in the instinct and in this life is basically very strict laws. These strict laws, if you don't follow them, you need to recognize that the rules and the laws that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had put in nature, they don't change. The rules and laws, they don't change, and they don't whatsoever give you an exception. They don't give an exception to anyone, and they don't change it to anyone, not to any nation, and they do not bend to anyone. And the Lord Almighty had cautioned his servants from the consequence of going and trying to change the laws that he had created in the world. And anybody that goes against the laws that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in nature, then in that situation, all you're going to see is that there's no savior from it. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَلَمَّا نَسُوا مَا ذُكِّرُوا بِهِ. When they had forgotten what they were reminded of, then the doors of everything will open to them. And then once they would be so happy about the doors of extravagance and ecstasy, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَخَذْنَاهُمْ بَغْتَةً. They would be taken, and when they would least expect it, it would be a sudden take. It would be a sudden destruction. فَإِذَا هُمْ مُبْلِسُونَ. Then would become history. They would become totally wiped out. فَقُطِعَ دَابِرُ الْقَوْمِ. Not just totally wiped out, they would become such a history where there would be no continuance, even with like a continuance to their history. It becomes, there's no continuance to them. It becomes just a history, and then there's nothing to trace them, or even nothing to later that they would inherit. That's why you would see even the pharaohs, no one actually stayed to preserve all those treasures. No one stayed. Why not? But it was worked on, it was great. No one wanted to keep any of those treasures. No one wanted to keep anything. They were totally wiped out. No one even wanted to keep any of those treasures. It was to them a curse, and indeed it was. And that's why right there Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, حَتَّى إِذَا أَخَذَتِ الْأَرْضُ زُخْرُفَهَا. When the earth itself, when they were living in all that zakhrafa, when they were living in all that extravagance, and then the people that were living in it, they thought that they had come to getting into the full control over everything. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَتَاهَا أمرنا ليلا أو نهار. Our order, our decree had come to it to bring an end to it during the night or even during the day. فجعلناها حصيدا كأن لم تغن بالأمس كذلك نفصل الآيات لقوم يتفكرون. It becomes nothing but as if it was nothing but an empty harvest, nothing but a harvest that was not even there, as if it was just a dried harvest, as if it was never at all, ever living a life of luxury, a life of extravagance. That's a sign for people to actually see and learn from. There's really a lot you could see. We only passed halfway in this book, but we'll inshallah continue next week speaking about the other part. So what is extravagance? Then what? We'll talk about that next week. And here's a sister. How do we implicit simplicity? That's the question we'll answer next week. And so inshallah, when you're talking about they don't buy unnecessary things, alhamdulillah, but however, they love to buy things branded like shoes, Nike, and who knows what it is. And I'm not into this, but my hubby is. And some of the relatives that passed it on to my older kids. I do, but good quality electronic stuff, etc. We'll talk about that next week. That is indeed, the lecture will continue next week. So should we actually buy big TVs and all of that? And what about a name brand? We'll talk about that next week, inshallah. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Are there any? Yeah, I think we're done. So if there are any questions before we leave the session for next week, go ahead. No one has any questions? All right. Well, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.